Hello, welcome, and thank you for being part of WorkSafe's webinar, Critical Changes to Workplace Exposure Standards for Airborne Contaminants. My name is Cameron Ling, and I'll be your host for this session. And in this webinar, we will be looking at the coming changes to workplace exposure standards, why and when these changes are being made, and practical steps for workplaces to prepare themselves. I'm joined today by WorkSafe Victoria expert Bronwyn Hayes, Senior Occupational Hygienist. Bronwyn's role covers a broad range of activities, including providing specialist advice to WorkSafe health and safety inspectors, developing occupational health and safety guidance, authorising asbestos and carcinogen licences, and following up on workplaces with elevated blood lead levels. Good afternoon, Bronwyn.
Good afternoon, Cameron.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, in a little bit, we will be taking questions from the audience, but please feel free to start putting your questions in there at any stage. If you've got one ready to go, put it in, and then later on, I will ask it on your behalf. Perhaps I could start, Bronwyn, by asking just what are exposure standards and why do we have them?
Yeah, sure. So we have exposure standards because there's a long history of workers becoming ill from breathing in high levels of airborne hazardous substances. And these substances could be things like gases, mists, dusts or fumes. So in the 1990s, Australia introduced laws on allowable limits on the airborne levels of some substances to control workplace exposure or workers' exposure, and these were called workplace exposure standards. And workplace exposure standards are set at levels which nearly all workers can be exposed to day after day over a working lifetime without causing harm to health. We've got three different types of exposure standards in Australia. We've got an 8-hour time-weighted average, a 15-minute short-term exposure limit, and a peak limitation, which is a level that can't be exceeded at any time.
I imagine then, Bronwyn, that lots of workplaces could have airborne hazardous substances. What sort of sectors typically have these hazards?
Yeah, so because there's over 700 exposure standards for different substances, you can imagine they'd be found in so many different workplaces. And so a couple of examples would be in agriculture, you've got things like pesticides and insecticides. In manufacturing, you've got solvents or gases. In construction, things like wood dust, crystalline silica dust, and mining, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and healthcare, things like nitrous oxide.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that, Bronwyn. So what are the current legal requirements under the regulations that workplaces must be following?
So in Australia, we've got a workplace exposure standards list. This is developed and maintained and published by Safe Work Australia. And in Victoria, we adopt this exposure standard list in the hazardous substances section of the OH&S regulations. So employers have duties under these regulations to ensure employees must not be exposed to levels of hazardous substances above the exposure standard.
Well, now that we know how exposure standards work and what some of the industries are that need to consider them, what changes are coming?
So there's some pretty significant changes coming, including a change of name from workplace exposure standard to workplace exposure limit. And we've also got the reason this name change is so that it will align with international language. A lot of places use limits. And also it's to emphasise that these are limits that can't be exceeded. And there's also going to be changes to standards in the well list to over 300 different substances. There'll be changes in values.
How are the actual exposure limits changing?
So these changes will include reductions in the levels for over 170 chemicals for things like bitumen fumes in road surfacing or wood dust in the timber industry and even solvents in common cleaning products. There's also going to be the addition of 31 new substances to this list, including things like diesel particulate matter, emission from diesel engines, and flour dust in the baking industry. There's also going to be changes to 25 substances that have been removed from the well list, and they're going to be put into a new category called non-threshold genotoxic carcinogens. And for these substances, they will have no exposure standard level because there's there's no safe level of exposure, so they'll have to be just treated to control exposure to the lowest level possible. There's also a separate list of 9 chemicals for proposed reduction to their exposure levels. Now, no decision's been made on these yet, as these are subject to a separate review process at a national level. And these substances include benzene, chlorine, copper, formaldehyde, hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen cyanide, nitrogen dioxide, titanium dioxide, and respirable crystalline silica.
This sounds like a lot of changes that people need to be aware of. Could you outline the background to why this is all happening now?
Yeah, so the first list of exposure standards was issued in 1990, which is quite a long time ago. It was last reviewed in 2003. And so since then, there's been more evidence has emerged on health effects for some of these chemicals at lower levels. So Safe Work Australia conducted a review using current scientific knowledge and looked at the health-based impacts of these chemicals. Their review involved consultation with stakeholders across Australia, and the result was workplace health and safety ministers agreed to implement all the health-based limits, with the exception of these 9 chemicals that I mentioned. Based on stakeholder feedback, they've requested an additional impact analysis for these 9 chemicals.
Is Victoria doing their own review, or will we automatically adopt all the SWA recommended changes to the wells?
Well, because WorkSafe Victoria doesn't follow the national model laws, we will be undertaking a separate impact assessment process, which needs to be done before we can adopt the wells. So at this point in time, we don't yet have endorsement to implement the wells. And also, additionally, for those 9 chemicals that I mentioned, they're still under national review, and no decisions been made on those at this stage. But what WorkSafe has been doing is informally chatting with representatives from industry associations and employers in Victoria to learn more about what potential impact of any of the change of these chemicals would be to these industries. And WorkSafe's developed a dedicated WES to Well landing page to allow workplaces to subscribe and receive updates as they become available. And this link is now live and can be found at this URL link that we've got, as well as the QR code.
Bronwyn, when will these changes be happening?
So the timeline for Victoria adopting the well is not yet known because of the decision still not being made. However, nationally, the well list will be implemented from the 1st of December 2026. But until any changes are made, workplaces still have to comply with the existing standards.
So what would you recommend that workplaces do to prepare for the WES to Well transition?
So I recommend that workplaces should do some preparation now and identify if you've got any chemicals that you use that have an exposure standard and whether employees may be exposed to airborne levels of that substance. And then also look up the Safe Work Australia list changes between WES and Well on the Safe Work Australia website to see if there is changes to these substances that you're using.
Well, building on that, Bronwyn, what should workplaces be doing if there are changes to the exposure standards for the chemicals they are using?
Yeah, so I think it's good if employers can start now to do some sort of assessment to first look what employee exposure levels currently are. Have they got any air monitoring data that they can use to compare to? Or do just a really rough assessment and work out what the potential exposure could be, because it all depends, like how much of the chemical do you use? Are you using large quantities? What tasks are they doing? Are they, pushing the substance into the air by spraying it to make, more concentration in the air, or are they just brushing it or pouring it? Also look at the form of the chemical. Is it a solid? Is it a liquid? Or is it a gas that's just readily dispersed into the air? And what controls, have you got controls currently in place? You could also engage an occupational hygienist to conduct air monitoring to see what your levels currently are.
We've spoken about changes to workplace exposure standards and when they will apply. This is a lot of information, and I'm sure employers and managers will be going away and thinking about what this means for them. Bronwyn, to summarise, what are the key takeaways you think people should be actioning today?
I think definitely workplaces should be considering what substances they're using that have got exposure standards. So, you can have a look up your hazardous substances register and look up safety data sheets to see if they've got exposure standards. And also do an assessment, determine whether employees might be exceeding the new exposure standard based on, what you're doing and how you're doing it. Also, it's really important to assess whether the controls you've got in place are the highest controls you can use. Are you using respirators or have you got engineering controls? Because as an employer, you have a requirement to identify if you are controlling exposure to the hazardous substances to levels below the exposure standard in accordance with the hierarchy of control. So, is there further things you can do to control your exposure to those hazardous substances?
Thanks for that great summary there, Bronwyn. That has given us great understanding of the changes coming in and how to approach them. I'd love to get to some of the questions from the audience now because there's a number coming through and I will endeavour to get to as many as I possibly can. I'll start with this first one because a lot of people wanting the answer to it. With so many references, what is the best resource to find the specific exposure limits?
Yes, so because we have our new dedicated landing page on the WorkSafe website, I'd recommend that you go on that and subscribe for any updates. And you can also go onto the Safe Work Australia website where there's heaps of information. There's the Where's to Well list. There's also, all the history and you can actually search up your exposure standards on the Safe Work Australia website as well.
Great. Bronwyn, you mentioned throughout there some of the changes for bakers around flour. This question relates to that. So will flour now be labelled as a hazardous substance and have flour manufacturers and mills been informed of this change?
So, it's a good question about hazardous substances because so not all substances that are hazardous have exposure standards. So you've got substances that have got exposure standards, but they're not actually categorised as hazardous substances. And so flour dust is actually not a hazardous substance, but it has an exposure standard because there's a risk of adverse health effects from inhaling, certain levels of flour dust. And so, what was the other half of that question? Sorry.
Around the mills and also the flour manufacturers. So I am not sure 100% about engagement with that, whether that was done on a national level by Safe Work Australia. Sorry, I can't really answer that one. That's fine. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. This one here, probably going to need a little bit of your help with one of the acronyms here. What controls need to be taken to comply with no exposure standard level for NTGC?
I think that's going to be a really big question because there is going to be no level. So sometimes some of those substances, they previously had exposure levels and they're going to not have an exposure level anymore. But all you can do is try and control your exposure to as far as reasonably practicable. So we really want employers to start seeing whether or not you can actually eliminate the use of that hazardous substance or then go to what is the highest order controls you can do. That will be the focus of those NTGCs. And I know it's a really difficult one and we're hoping that we can provide some guidance on that in the future, but at the moment we don't have any guidance on that.
Great, thank you. I'm glad you said that at the end because the end of that question was if elimination and substitution is not possible, but hope to have some guidance soon. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. This one, a number of people wanting the answer to as well. Our exposure limits change constantly. Is there a way to determine exposure without having to get an occupational hygienist in each time?
Well, the best way to do it is to do monitoring, and there's all different types of monitoring processes and techniques depending on what the substance is. And so that will actually give you the actual concentration. But as I mentioned earlier, you can do a really rough assessment because you really don't need to do monitoring if you know that you're not likely to be having any airborne levels or having very low airborne levels when the exposure standard is going to be quite high. So the regulations talk about you must do air monitoring if there's uncertainty on the level of exposure. If you're certain you're going to be exceeding the exposure, then you would just go straight to controls. If you are certain that you are not going to be exceeding exposure, you need to have evidence of how you're not exceeding exposure. You know, what have you based that belief on? And you would really need to have pretty robust information on justifying why you're not exceeding exposure. But then it all depends, like, have you got a substance? It depends, you know, are you using it a lot? Is there a lot of the substance? Is it readily airborne? Are you making it readily airborne? Or have you got a process that's fully enclosed? Because sometimes, you know, you might have a fully sealed enclosed process and it's designed for that substance to be contained. So in those situations, you know, it's not likely that you will get exposure. It's a really difficult one. Unfortunately, it's hard to explain it as a general thing, but I think you could get advice. You could seek advice from an occupational hygienist, you could read. There's a bit of guidance on that as well.
Great. Thank you, Bronwyn. This one here, what were the driving factors for the changes to the exposure standards, and how much data was collected to validify the changes?
Yes, so the review was done by Safe Work Australia. I can't really comment exactly on how much data they collected. We did. I know that when they put it out for feedback and, I think people did assessments, their own assessments, you know, seeing how Safe Work Australia did that review. But I think if you want more information, go on the Safe Work Australia website. All the history is on there. But I can't really comment on exactly the amount of information they used.
Fair enough. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. Next one here, and again, I'm going to try my best with some of the pronunciations, so I might need your help.
Sure.
Can you please advise us on the well for acrylonitrile?
Acrylonitrile, yep.
And acrylamide.
Oh, okay. I actually do know those ones.
Great,
so
thank you.
Acrylonitrile and acrylamide, I'm pretty sure they've both been put on the NTGC list, the non-threshold genotoxic carcinogens list. So they will have no exposure standard anymore. But that doesn't mean that they don't have to be controlled. The reason is they're both have classification as carcinogens. They're known to cause cancer in humans. And so what Safe Work Australia is, there's no safe exposure level. And so that's one, again, where you'll have to go and probably reassess what controls you've got in place and see whether you can actually implement more controls in that area. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you for your help on that one.
Oh, that's right.
Are all of the 9 substances that are due to be reviewed, such as benzene and formalin, is it?
Formaldehyde, yep.
Formaldehyde, all group 1 carcinogens?
It's hard to remember exactly what was in the list. Possibly. No, maybe not. Actually, no, I don't think so, because there's some substances on there that are not. But, you know, formaldehyde is a class 1 carcinogen. Benzene is, and I can't remember what the other one you said was. But, yeah, I don't think
they were the only 2 examples.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, I don't think they all are. But you can always check that on the Safe Work Australia website. Sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head.
That's okay. Thank you, Bronwyn. Yeah. How will inspectors monitor compliance with the new workplace exposure limits?
Yeah, so the way we'll do compliance will not really change as far as it's under the hazardous substances regulations, and ensuring that employers are meeting those duties under the hazardous substances regulations. And so those main 2 duties are that they have to control employee exposure to below exposure standard, and then control exposure in accordance with the hierarchy of control. So inspectors will be going out there and seeing if they have worked through the hierarchy of control process, and rather than just rely on respiratory protection. But obviously it depends on the workplace and the process and the task and everything, because, it's always so variable. It's all about doing an assessment, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. How often is air and health monitoring required?
So the air monitoring, there's no requirements in the regs for a frequency of air monitoring, but it does specify about uncertainty. So it's about perhaps you've changed your process, you've implemented new controls, or you might have some inquiries from the HSR about what the levels are. So then under the regs, you are required to do air monitoring. Health monitoring is different. So in health monitoring, it's only for the scheduled hazardous substances that are listed in the back of our regulations that health monitoring is required. And there's about 13 hazardous substances. And then only if employees are exposed to those and it's likely to lead to adverse health effects. So, yeah.
The next one here, Bronwyn, just a clarification needed around something that you've already touched on. Is there an estimated date when a decision on the 9 additional chemicals will occur? Will there be a grace period beyond 1 December 2026?
Yeah, I can't really answer that one because it's all up to it's all up to the ministers and. Yeah, I know. I think just my best advice would be to log on to that WorkSafe webpage and when you register your company, it will just come up with the latest news and information that's happening. Sorry, I know people want to know dates, but I just can't. I don't have any. Sorry.
That's fine. That's fine.
Yep.
You can only answer with the information you have, Bronwyn. So
Yep.
Appreciate that. This one, another clarification from a previous question. There is no safe exposure limit in the upcoming standard for NTGC. Does this mean elimination/substitution of the agent is the only acceptable solution?
Yeah, I can understand why people would be asking that question, and no is the main answer, I suppose. But I think just keep going back to the hazardous substances regulations and the hierarchy of control, and also what's reasonably practicable. So our whole Act and regulations always go back to what's reasonably practical. So if you can't eliminate, I know there's industries that manufacture, some of those NTGCs. So you definitely can't eliminate it or substitute it. So it would be then looking at, have you used or, researched or implemented the highest order controls you can?
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah.
This one, again, you're going to have to help me with this one.
Yeah, that's right.
Is WorkSafe setting the standards for nanomaterials?
Yeah, I can't really answer that one. Not at this stage. We don't have a standard for nanomaterials. Sorry, I can't really answer that one. Yeah.
Not a problem at all. Thank you, Bronwyn. I'll keep asking them.
Yep.
If you can't answer them, that's completely fair enough. Where can we obtain a copy of the regulatory impact statement for these changes?
I am just guessing that it's on the Safe Work Australia website, but I don't know. Actually, it might not be true. Sorry, can't answer that one either.
That's fine. I'll move to the next one. A number of people wanting this one.
Yep.
What's the process of including new substances to the exposure standards? Isoflurane gas, an anaesthetic widely used in vet and medical industries, has no WES.
Yeah. So it would have to go through Safe Work Australia, and there is a process for adding substances. That's not at a state or WorkSafe level. But just because there's no WES doesn't mean that you don't control exposure. So a lot of substances that don't have an exposure standard, often there is an industry standard or, a best practice standard. And so WorkSafe would be looking to see if workplaces are meeting those standards. And it's based on health effects, really.
This next one, just jumping back to something you mentioned a little bit earlier. Earlier, you mentioned nitrous oxide in hospitals. Can you please expand on that?
Expand. I suppose it's just the use of nitrous oxide in hospitals and employee exposure to that. That was probably not a great example either, because I think when I just recently double checked that, it doesn't actually reduce the current exposure standard, but there is an exposure standard for nitrous oxide. So it might be if a worker is administering it to a patient and then somehow the gas had a leak and people were exposed, there is exposure standards for that.
Great, thank you so much. This one again, a few people wanting the answer to. How do I know if I've got airborne substances that have exposure standards and whether these will be above the new workplace exposure levels?
Yeah, I think because a lot of people, aren't even aware that there's exposure standards for a lot of substances. And I think the best place to start is get your safety data sheets for the substances you use. So under the HazSubs regs, you have to have a register of your hazardous substances, and that requires you to also have a list of the safety data sheets. And then if you go through the safety data sheets, there's actually a section, I can't remember which section it is, and it will list the exposure standards. So I'd recommend you go through those safety data sheets, look at the levels, and then you could engage an occupational hygienist to do air monitoring, or, like I mentioned before, do a really rough assessment on how much you're using and how you're using it. And, just make sort of a really, just a rough guess of what the level may be. Or you can just, talk to occupational hygienists. They can help you out too.
Great, thank you. This one, just looking for a bit more information as well. Where can I find out more information about the proposed changes to exposure standards?
Yeah, so there is a list which has a comparison of the existing WES to WELL, so it's got both levels on it, and it's really easy to sort of navigate. So there will be a link on the WorkSafe website for that list if you subscribe to the QR code, and you can also go to the Safe Work Australia website and find it there too.
Great, thank you, Bronwyn. Is health monitoring required for the 33 airborne contaminants that are on NTGCs? If not, what is the list name for these contaminants?
The list name. Health monitoring is only required for those substances listed in our schedule at the back of the regulations, which there is I think there's about 13 substances. That's under the regulatory, requirements on the hazardous substances regulations. And then what was the other half of the question? Sorry.
That's right. Is health monitoring required for the 33 airborne contaminants that are on NTGCs? If not, what is the list name for these contaminants?
Oh, okay. So the ones that do require health monitoring, they're just called scheduled hazardous substances, in the regulations. So sometimes you can be required to do health monitoring for other substances under the OH&S Act, but it depends on whether or not it's a hazardous substance.
Speaking of monitoring, this question relates to that. How do the exposure limits link with biological monitoring? Will this guidance be updated?
So some exposure standards do have biological exposure indices, and there are a few on the Safe Work Australia website. I don't think they've been updated. I've been so focused on the airborne exposure standards. I'd have to look into that a bit further.
No worries. Thank you, Bronwyn. This next one here, a few people wanting the answer to. How will WorkSafe inspectors determine if there is an issue with workplace contaminants in the workplace? Is the burden of proof on inspectors or businesses?
So the burden of proof is on the businesses, and really what the inspectors do is come and ask the businesses how they've come to that decision, whether or not, you're exceeding the exposure standard. So that's why workplaces are required to do an assessment, and whether that involves getting air monitoring done or, doing their own assessment, that's what the inspectors will be asking. How have you determined whether or not you're uncertain the exposure standard is exceeded, and or whether you can tell us that, it's not likely to be exceeded.
To assist with that, Bronwyn, there's a question around it. Is there a calculator that will assist to do the math for the exposure levels?
No, not really. No, because it's sort of about understanding what the chemical is, how much of it's released into the air volume. You can do a calculation that way, and the release rate, and then the dilution rate of the air. It's kind of it's quite complicated. So we wouldn't expect workplaces to be able to do that calculation.
Okay. This one, as a builder, do we control the processes that subcontractors use for their products? What if their swims aren't up to scratch?
Yeah, so there is a duty if you are subcontracting to ensure that they've got adequate processes and procedures. So, we would expect that you would be asking for those swims. And if it's not up to scratch, you'd be saying, you need to update these procedures, and otherwise, you can't do the work.
This one, a really important one, a few people wanting the answer to. Where do obligations end with the sale of an item that does have an exposure standard, such as the sale of gravel with silica?
Yep, so that would actually come under the silica regulations. That's a bit different. So there's different obligations under the silica regulations in providing information providing information on the product, and that there's silica contained, and health effects and that type of thing. That's a bit different to the hazardous substances regulations. Even though silica is a hazardous substance, it would actually fall under the silica regulations.
Okay. This one here, and I hope you understand it. Is there an update on chromates?
Yes. Well, what I can say is, so you've got chromium-6, which is a known carcinogen, and that is one of those substances that's been put into the NTGC. So it currently has an exposure standard, and if, as of the 1st December 2026, when this is passed, it will not have an exposure standard. So that'll be another one of those substances you have to control, to the highest level, and ensuring you're implementing the highest order controls.
I've got one here, Bronwyn. It's a statement with a question as well.
Yeah.
Silica is down to 0.2, it says.
0.25, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Tram goes past, or there's wind, and I will be over the exposure limit. How to practically manage on construction sites, even with silica suppression?
So the silica exposure standard is an 8-hour time-weighted average, which means it's your average exposure over that whole 8 hours. It's not a single measurement. So say you get a high peak, or like a cloud of silica blows over you, not that I'd recommend that, but you might exceed that level. But then if you don't have any more exposure for the rest of the day, your 8-hour time-weighted average can be still below the exposure standard. So it's all about, I think it's all about, us expecting you to just have the highest possible controls. Are you using water and respirators if you can, or on-tool extraction systems and that type of thing?
This next one, Bronwyn, I'm definitely going to need your assistance. With the proposed WES for DPM,
Yes.
Do you think the level of 0.05 milligrams per metres cubed is achievable in industries such as tunnelling? Why not adapt AIOH recommended level of 0.1?
Yeah, I can't really comment on that because I am not the one who's proposed the level and setting the level. That's up to Safe Work Australia, and all I can suggest is people provide feedback where it's requested by either Safe Work Australia or WorkSafe Victoria when they're asking for stakeholder feedback, and provide as much feedback as you can in those situations.
Fair enough. Thank you, Bronwyn. What support will be available for duty holders if the well is adopted?
I think we're still coming up with, we've been working with stakeholders to try and find out what sort of support that WorkSafe can provide. And we will, hopefully come up with, guidance and other forms of support. So just, keep your eye on that webpage and hopefully, there'll be more things coming out.
Great, thank you. Safety data sheets currently state the WES. Is there a requirement for chemical suppliers to state wells in the safety data sheet before the 1st of December 2026?
That's a good question. I'd never thought about that one. But not before 1st December 2026 because the standards won't be in. But I would imagine after that date, they would be required to adjust the terminology and the levels. Yeah. So that would be quite a lot of work in modifying the safety data sheets. Yep.
Great. Thank you, Bronwyn. Why are some chemicals not included in the well list yet?
I think because, it's limited to a certain number of substances and, not every substance has an exposure standard. And also because under our Act and regulations, there's duties to provide a safe working environment. So say you are using a substance that, is known to be harmful and there's no exposure standard, I think I mentioned before, our expectation is you are controlling exposure to that as far as reasonably practical and implementing, the best controls you can. It's a difficult one when there's not an exposure standard, but it's just about reducing exposure. And often there's industry standards too that we can use.
Speaking of difficult ones, this next one is going to be difficult for you to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Yeah.
Southern Cross Station is definitely causing exposure to diesel fumes. Any action to control this exposure to public? Question mark.
Oh, is there?
Is there any action to control this exposure to public?
Well, I mean, I'm not involved in that, so I don't know. I can't really comment on that at the moment, unfortunately.
That's fair enough, Bronwyn. I wanted to still ask it, but completely understand. Not a question, but I love the way Bronwyn answers questions. There you go. Even if she isn't 100% certain of the full answer, she is a well of information. Big fan. Well, there's a pump up for you, Bronwyn.
Thank you very much.
But I'm going to continue on with some questions. Thank you to the person who put that one in there. I've already asked that one. Is PVC fumes exposure from plastic product manufacturing a risk?
Well, it can be. It would depend on the fume and the process. So you'd need to work out what's in that fumes. In the PVC, there could be some sort of chlorine released. So it should be controlled, but it also depends on the temperature. Don't forget. So, what's the vapor pressure of that substance as well? Sorry, that's a bit chemical, but it comes down to the substance, I should say. But it all should be controlled as far as you can.
That's great. No, I appreciate that, Bronwyn. I think that's the end of all the questions that we have at the moment. I know some of them were very, very tricky. I've had one just come through really late here, Bronwyn.
Okay.
So I'll keep the tricky ones coming at you if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Some of the proposed levels are below the current lab analysis LORs limits, this would lead to inaccurate results. How do we get down to that level?
Yes, that is something we've been working on. And it depends on the substance. So some substances I know at current standards, they can't measure to those levels, but there's new technologies coming in where you possibly can measure to a lower level. But it is something that we know is an issue. And yeah, we're going to have to work on that. Yeah, it's a really difficult one to answer, but great question.
Got another one snuck in here, Bronwyn, so I'll keep them coming at you. Are there any regulations for methylene chloride used for paint removal or stripping off paints and coatings?
Regulations, well, they would fall under the hazardous substances regulations and DG regulations. And definitely there is an exposure standard for that. And it can be a pretty harmful environment. So it's something that would need a really strict risk assessment process and very high level controls.
That makes a lot of sense. They're just going to keep sneaking a few in here. I'll get to as many of these as I possibly can until time doesn't allow us anymore. What are my obligations as an employer about how we control exposure?
As an employer, so you have those duties under the hazardous substances regulations to control exposure in accordance with the hierarchy of control. So we really do expect employers to be looking at elimination or substitution if you can. But so far as is reasonably practicable. And then can you implement engineering controls and just go down the list.
That makes sense. Bronwyn, I reckon I'm going to let you off the hook. The questions are done. It has been outstanding to have you as part of this webinar. Bronwyn, really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Cameron.
Well, we hope that everybody has found this an interesting and informative session, and going by the questions, I think they certainly have. This webinar will also be available on WorkSafe's website from next month. We do value your opinion on our Health and Safety Month events, so soon we will be sending you an online survey. We would love it if you could provide feedback so that we can incorporate your suggestions into our program next year. All respondents will go into the draw to win one of 5 $100 gift cards. Shortly, we will show on screen a list of most of the contacts or programs that we have covered here today. However, if you do require further information, we recommend that you head to the WorkSafe website. And if you can't find what you need there, there is also the WorkSafe advisory line, or in an emergency, the emergency line. Well, this is the final session of a huge WorkSafe Health and Safety Month. We've travelled across the state aiming to help educate as many people as possible on the importance of staying safe in the workplace. The team has travelled to places such as Mildura, Bendigo, Traralgon, Horsham, Shepparton, Warrnambool, Dandenong, just to name a few, plus a week's worth of webinars. So I want to say a huge thank you to the entire team that has put this Health and Safety Month together and spread that very important message right across Victoria. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you for being a part of this webinar and stay safe.